A pinhole leak in the copper line sometimes occurs through natural wear and tear, but this particular home had a recirculation pump. These pumps can cause the hot side piping to fail quicker. From the same hole, you could have a small amount of water or a large amount, and it changes on its own. I can spend hours under the house, on the roof, in the attic, or even in a hole. That's just part of the job. This is underneath the crawl space. Some have more space, some have a lot less space. Admittedly, it's not a fun job, but somebody has to do it. After leaving for parts, this is me returning with the materials needed. You have to suit up every time you go underneath, and if you're gonna be dirty, you have to protect yourself so you don't track that dirt everywhere else you go. It's incredibly important to know how to depressurize the system in order to do any kind of repair safely. You definitely need to understand the system and know how to isolate the areas that you're working on. Some areas of the repair are at accelerated speeds just for the sake of minimizing repetition. You have to take a lot into consideration when taking on a repair like this. One thing is that once you cut that pipe, all the residual water inside the piping is going to exit there at that lowest point. Excavating a hole to catch all the residual water is incredibly important to minimize mess and for safety. When working down there, you have to consider this abandoned pipe right here is an abandoned water line. It is the same type of material as a gas line, and in some homes these lines are not abandoned and still being used. Because they're still being used, you have to be very careful, and it's best not to cut anything you don't absolutely have to. This is the pipe in question. You can barely even see the little dot there, but that dot is where the leak was coming from. Some would think it's a weld, but it's not actually a weld, it's a pinhole. This job requires a lot of prep work as well as specialty equipment, on top of which these pieces of equipment have lengths that you have to consider when taking on the repair. it's not going to do you any good to attempt a repair in an area where your tool won't fit, because then you're quoted for the wrong job and you have to go about it in a different way. What I'm going to be using in this repair is press technology, which doesn't require heat, it actually requires an O-ring and compression. In order to make the best possible connections, you have to follow some steps for the installation. Sanding it down to clean it up, but then also kind of polishing it up to get a nice good connection to the O-ring. And then to ensure your connection is good, you also have to use a Sharpie to measure that the fitting that went in, it went in entirely, and that it doesn't slip out when you're actually using the tool to make the compression. This level of care and prep for every single connection needs to be made to ensure that everything works great. Keep in mind that if you use a fitting has two male pieces of pipe that insert into it, meaning that this has to be done at least twice. So then when you go over and analyze how many fittings were actually used in the job, then you realize that for each of those fittings, I had to do this process twice. So again, it looks like a small area that was repaired, but each piece of this repair takes a lot of attention to detail to ensure that it not only fixes the problem, but you don't call me back right away for this area. This area theoretically should outlast the rest of your plumbing system. As I always say, if you're gonna call me back, it's not gonna be to redo my job twice. Anything worth doing is worth doing right. So take as much time as is required to make sure the homeowner understands the amount of care that goes into even the most simple plumbing repairs. A handyman on this particular job showed up and told the homeowner that it's an easy job, it'll be done in 20 minutes. He told the homeowner that it would be just a bad weld, something you could easily fix without even having to replace anything. Long story short, once he saw it, he realized he was out of his depth. And then I come in, and this repair took about 2 hours, not including the time that I had to leave to go get materials. You can't trust when somebody who doesn't do this for a living quotes you on the complexity or the time of the job, because they don't have any experience to realize how involved this can actually be. The job requires that you assess the situation, you evaluate the risks, you proceed cautiously, you're suited up and prepared for this type of endeavor. And as you can see, me in the background, you have to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations for extended periods of time without losing focus. Something you might find a little amusing is that throughout the duration of me taking all these repairs, in most cases, I have to answer my phone and deal with customers on the fly. I've actually had a few video calls in an emergency situation where I'm under the house, but I'm explaining to them how to shut off the water to mitigate a problem until I can get out there. A lot of different responsibilities are required for these kinds of jobs because if you have an emergency, you want to know that I'm going to answer you. Some people could have trouble just sustaining your head up in the air like this for hours on end, and this is just one of the unique muscles that we have to develop for the task at hand. You gotta be able to be comfortable in these awkward, uncomfortable situations for 8 hours at a time. right now, this is at least 200% speed, meaning basically twice as fast. Certain areas, I'm actually kicking it up to 400% just so you can, not spend all day watching this. But yeah, this is what the job's actually like. Tedious, time consuming. I don't quite use a tape measure because a tape measure would be great in an ideal scenario where you've got a fixed location and you're taking actual measurements in a controlled environment. But because of the angle that I'm working on, I don't necessarily know that this measurement is going to be super accurate, especially when the pipe itself has a little bit of play to it. So what I do is I pre-assemble everything and I mark everything as an exact match, regardless of whatever length it is. I size everything up, complete product to complete product, to see where you can actually get this just right. Because with the tape measure, sometimes you will find yourself a little bit too long or too short. And what ultimately happens is in that event, you put a pipe in there for the sake of getting the job done, because trying to cut off an eighth of an inch is going to be particularly difficult. However, that eighth of an inch that's out of place, it doesn't just exist in a harmless extent. It continues to live on in the system, causing strain to it. So for instance, if you have two fittings and the correct measurement, let's say, is 6 3/4, but you put 7 inches, even though it's only a quarter of an inch, for that extra quarter of an inch, it's going to stress one of the 90s or both of them equally. Sometimes one takes all the blunt of it, but those 90s are going to be pushed under pressure. And if your expected life of the pipe is an X amount of time, you're going to reduce it in that one spot that's taking all that extra strain. It's these little details that actually will slowly defeat the system if your installers or the plumber is not aware of how these little details can affect the rest of the system. You could have a leak a few feet over from an area that was just repaired, sometimes because of just dumb luck. But sometimes it could be these little details that worked against the system and maybe could have been prevented. But if your plumber doesn't value these effects and these details, well, there's not much you could do about it. And that's why you want to get somebody who understands this, because at the end of the day, it'll minimize your troubles and the problems you'll deal with. like I was saying before, this repair is exactly what the system needed. These pipes are to the exact length needed to complement the fact that these pipes are not perfectly level that are currently existing. Each pipe has its own angle from straps, from whatever reason. These fittings are in there to accommodate the existing system and not add pressure to it. It's impossible to say with absolute certainty what caused the fitting to go bad. It could have been the installation, it could have been that the pipe was not deburred, it could have been the fact that it's on a hot water pipe on a recirculation pump that's only been in 3 years and only a few hours. I would say, however, it could have been as simple as a defective part. The only thing I could tell you from experience is there is a right way of installing these parts to help maximize the life of the piping, and there's definitely a way of making the system struggle unnecessarily. These pieces of equipment right here are ProPress technology. They will compress the round bevel on these fittings and close the seal of the O-ring around the fitting. It'll also crimp the pipe just a little bit, making it so that these fittings cannot come undone anymore. This is a newer system that a lot of people aren't super aware of. And just like regular couplings, there are couplings on one side that are designed to stop once the pipe is fully inserted. And then there's another coupling that's designed to slide all the way through. And that's how you can get a fitting to connect in a system like this, where it's a straight run and the pipes do not move. This tool has a head adapter that needs to be swapped out for the different size fittings and different heads for different types of materials. The connections that were just completed were 3/4 of an inch. That's why I was using a 3/4 inch head. Now the head needs to come out so that I could use it for the 1/2 inch head. Again, these heads are pretty heavy, and it's just another piece of equipment that needs to be dragged throughout the job, especially how this repair has two different sizes in play. You have the 1/2 inch on the bottom and the 3/4 inch on the top. This is another example of the many obstacles in the job. There is a galvanized pipe here that was abandoned from a previous repipe, but it's in the way of the tool. So if that was an active line or maybe a gas line or something, that would complicate an attempt to complete this repair. So when I give out a proposal, I need to mentally go through the job and figure out if I'm even capable of executing it as I intend to. In this particular case, the galvanized is in the way, but there is another angle which would allow me to use the tool. But if this galvanized was more of a permanent problem, I would have to probably do a larger section of piping to accommodate it in a weird way. And that's why some of these jobs can be smaller or bigger because of the variables that we have to contend with in the existing plumbing or home structure. And that's it. All of this time, energy, prep was just to complete that small little section of pipe. Now, that was causing water damage down below, and it was hot water, so humidity and steam was accumulating in the crawl space. There could be all kinds of negative repercussions of having a problem like this go untreated. And even though the hole was incredibly tiny, the damage was pretty significant. There are systems to protect the home that'll automatically shut off the water in the detection of a leak. Those systems I do install, but this home didn't already have it, meaning that this leak had gone on for weeks before she actually realized it was something more serious. Once the job is complete, it has to be inspected, and then you have to haul all the equipment and debris back out of the crawl space. In this particular instance, it was a shorter run, but in other cases, we're not so lucky. It's important to pressurize the system, and you gotta go back underneath and verify there's no leaks. No leaks.